Simon, let's begin from modernity question. Hundreds years ago, radio represented most modern media, and how it was received in Great Britain back then.
You're right, it's seen as one of the great new modern means of communication, and it's a sign of the roaring 20s, as it's called, of the noise, the glamour, the novelty of these new technologies. And I think it's quite expensive to buy a radio set in the 1920s, but it becomes cheaper and cheaper. And the sets become better, so people can afford to buy a radio set, or they may have friends who they can listen to, come together. And I think what really strikes people so much about early radio is that for the first time, you can hear the voices of someone at a distance from you, and they're the genuine voices, and they're live, and they're real. So in early radio, there's a lot of emphasis put on liveness. The fact that you are listening at the time it's not recorded, you are getting the unmediated original sound from people and places. I think the thing that we, in Britain, when we think about the history of radio, we lose a little bit, is just how international radio was as well in those times. So a lot of people listened to the BBC in Britain, but also they listened to stations from across Europe. And in some cases, if you stayed up very late at night, you could listen to America, and people could hear for themselves foreign languages, foreign speakers, and get a sense of being connected, not just nationally, but internationally, in a way that really wasn't possible before.
Way of international travel, transatlantic travel, not with the ship, but via radio.
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of the image that people used was the radio magic carpet that could carry you to a foreign land.
Actually, speaking about other media outlets like newspapers, we were direct competitors to radio, I guess, from the beginning, and the emergence of BBC actually connected to the printed media strike in 1926. Could you reveal a little bit more on this? Because the BBC as a company emerged in that year, 1926, quite fast because of this famous strike.
You're right, the radio was seen as a big source of competition by newspaper owners, and they were very worried that it was going to take away all their business. So when radio was first introduced in Britain in 1922, there were very strict limits placed on how much news the BBC could broadcast, when it could broadcast it. It had to take the news from the news agency. It couldn't have its own journalists. But then with the general strike in 1926, when the newspapers also were disrupted by the strikes, the government saw the BBC as a key means of communicating with the British public. So the government worked closely with the BBC during the general strike. It provided official news to the BBC. And from that point onwards, the BBC had much more flexibility, and the government reduced the restrictions on broadcasting news. And really, in the 1920s, and particularly the 1930s, the BBC starts to become the real medium for bringing up-to-date news to people, official news as well, and also live coverage of great events. So famously, the big fire that happens at the Crystal Palace in London, when it burns down, there's a BBC journalist there, and he explains to people what's happening live. And that's really the first time in the 1930s you get live news coming straight from the event to people in their homes.
And of course, entertainment, not to be missed. Music, orchestras, and live broadcasts from Royal Opera House. When did the first broadcast from Royal Opera House happened? Or if there any other date of, let's say, first live music or something, the orchestra, which could be also the point of beginning of music, live music on radio.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very early. So I think it's among the first broadcasts in Britain is broadcasting live music. There are lots of connections between bands in hotels and sort of jazz bands as well. But then the BBC has a mission to inform, educate, and entertain. And it really thinks education is very important in the 1920s and 30s. So lots of classical music, lots of connections with opera, with the big symphony orchestras, and the BBC becomes one of the big patrons of British classical music in the 1920s
Of course.
and 1930s.
Oh, well, because jazz didn't have a very good reputation in the 30s, right?
No, I think jazz broadcasting is only late at night and never at the weekend, never on a Sunday, because the BBC was very keen to keep the Sabbath
Clean.
Yes, exactly.
Simon, if we would now turn the radio in 30s, what sort of program we would hear on air?
It very much depends in Britain where you're living, what time of day you're listening. There's not continuous broadcasting through the day. So the sort of our familiarity with turning on the radio and hearing music at any time of day, that's not really possible. The BBC only broadcasts for certain hours. In the evening and the afternoon, it's broadcasting for families, it's broadcasting acceptable material for dinner time
For
listening, light music. A lot of people say very boring music for dinner time, but programs for children start very, very early in Britain. So after school, there are programs for young children. There are lots of talks, lectures. So they will invite a professor maybe who could be very boring, could be very interesting to talk to the public, but also comedy. So comedy is a real feature of British broadcasting right from the beginning. And there are connections with the popular theatres where performers perform comedy, popular music, that's broadcast live as well. And then later in the evening, you might have serious classical music, but you might have some dance music as well, late at night. And then on Sunday, in the 1920s and early 1930s, lots of religious music. But the BBC has to stop that in the later 1930s because people listen to Europe instead, where they can hear lots of popular music from Luxembourg and places like that. So the BBC has to become more popular on a Sunday.
Okay, I think Lithuanian radio still broadcasts the Catholic Mass from Cathedral every Sunday. So the tradition is kept. Speaking about news coverage and about the network of the journalists around the world, I know that VC had a journalist in Riga quite early, and he reported on Lithuania and Lithuanian radio in 30s. Could you tell more about this?
Yes.
Lithuanian coverage.
Yes, so the BBC has a magazine for people who like to listen to foreign stations. So when Lithuania starts broadcasting, that's reported so that people in Britain can tune in and listen to the Lithuanian broadcasts as well. One of the first things that they talk about is how after the coup of 1926, there is broadcasts in French as well as Lithuanian from that station for international audiences to persuade them that this has been a peaceful and stable transition of government. So right from the beginning, that station, which was at Kaunas, that's being used to speak to international audiences about events within Lithuania. Then as the time progresses, you see coverage of some of the talks that are coming out of Lithuania. And then in particular, in 1937, Lithuanian radio produces an orchestral program for listeners around Europe, which is picked up by something called the International Broadcasting Union and is fed to radio stations all around Europe so they can hear a representative concert of folk music and classical music from Lithuania. So it's a voice of international diplomacy and cultural reach for Lithuania right from the 1930s.
You opened very interesting, remarkable date because it's sort of first Euro radio broadcast from Lithuania to around the world. What's actually happening right now too, international exchange of concerts and music via EBU. Actually, interwar period associates us with authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes using radio as a very useful outlet for spreading their ideas and getting to the power, indoctrinating people, and everything is accessible within one turn of the tuner. So was it the object to some sort of censorship or somehow to play a war with those radio stations which are not desirable to be heard in your country?
There's a big change that happens in the early 1930s. So in the 1920s, people hope that different countries can exchange programs and promote goodwill and understanding, but they'll work together. The big broadcasters will work with each other to achieve this. From the early 1930s, you get governments typically setting up radio stations in different parts of Europe, which are aiming directly to broadcast cultural programs, but also propaganda directly across borders in different languages to try and act as a means of propaganda and persuasion. So some of the early cases of that are in places like Hungary, broadcasting to minorities around Hungary because of all of the minorities in different parts of the former Habsburg Empire that have been left by the treaties after the First World War. Then you get similar broadcasting between Germany and Poland over contested areas, and very often setting up radio stations right next to the contested area to broadcast into that area. When it then starts to become even more intense is with the Mussolini's Italian invasion of Abyssinia, where Mussolini uses radio to broadcast his propaganda message, but particularly in Arabic, into the Middle East to try and disrupt British and French regional power, and also with Hitler's Germany. And pretty much as soon as Hitler wins power in 1933, you have the radio starting up propaganda broadcasts from Munich into Austria to subvert the Austrian government, and then more and more German stations broadcasting propaganda into places like the Sudeten parts of the Czech lands. So it really becomes a very powerful weapon of propaganda in the 1930s. Okay,
and that leads us to the Second World War period, when radio really gained a new role, the source of hope, source of information, and also another battlefield, as you just mentioned. And I remember that the French and British broadcasters, they used Beethoven Fifth to annoy Germans while sending all of propaganda messages. So Germans were not able to abandon Beethoven, saying that. So it was really smart use of soft power, let's say. But anyway, the role of radio during Second World War. What was the? I guess that during 40s already, radio was almost in every household, right?
Yes, certainly in Northwestern Europe. I think in other parts of Europe, radio ownership isn't so widespread, but there's a lot of communal listening. So people gather together to listen to a radio set, and that could be in a bar, in a cafe, or it could be meeting in a friend's home. But of course, in parts of occupied Europe, that's a very dangerous thing to do, because if you're listening to foreign radio in occupied Europe, that's illegal, and the punishments can be very, very severe. So people have to try and find ways to listen to radio. They have to listen in secret, but there is very strong evidence of a lot of listening across borders. And I think even in Nazi Germany, the German state estimates millions of Germans listen to Allied broadcasts secretly and illegally. So it is something that is seen as a threat by many governments, but it's very hard to stop. And this is why radio is such a powerful tool of propaganda, because it doesn't respect borders. It doesn't stop at the national border, and it's not like a newspaper where you can ban it and keep it out. Radio comes whatever you do, and even if you try to jam it, it can still be possible for people to listen. So it plays a very important part in World War II propaganda.
Speaking about the role in nation's history, so Chamberlain declares war in 1939 via radio, famous Churchill speech 40s. Then, well, we all saw the magnificent movie King's Speech, and everything happens actually on air, on radio. So it's a really historical broadcasts, which are in the history book, well, defined nation's faith, actually.
Yes, definitely. And I think that film has some historical inaccuracies, but this idea that it carries messages not just within Britain when you're broadcasting about the royal family, but all across the world. And there's an audience for broadcasts about the royal family and by the royal family all across the world. One of the things that the BBC is very keen to do in the 1930s and the 1940s is strengthen connections with America because of the importance of that alliance in a future war. And also because of a sense that there is a strong cultural connection between Britain and America that radio can encourage. So all of those royal speeches are picked up by American radio stations and broadcast to American listeners. There's a story of during one of the King's speeches that there's a radio equipment in the American studio that fails, and so one of the engineers picks up the two pieces of wire and connects them and is electrocuted, but it allows the broadcast to go on. So the British government sends the engineer, I think it's some jeweled cufflinks as a thank you. And he writes back and he says, oh, this wasn't true. This was a public relations story dreamt up by my radio company. It never happened.
Oh, it's marketing.
Exactly. It's good marketing.
Yeah.
But it shows you, how important these broadcasts are and how, they're seen as being a big prestige moment for American radio stations.
Well, speaking about American and British relations, later BBC will have an important role during Cold War period as one of the, let's say, main outlets back then. What you would say about this Cold War period? What are the significant moments for radio? Keeping in mind that already in 60s we have the emergence of television, the new media competing already with radio.
Yes. The Cold War, again, it's a time when the ability of radio to cross borders is incredibly important. And it's seen as being really the only way to penetrate the Iron Curtain and to allow communication both ways, but certainly into the Eastern Bloc. I think as well, you have the legacy of the Second World War, and you have in Britain and in other countries, people who have been used to fighting that propaganda war in the Second World War, and they take the same methods and ideas and they use that to fight the Cold War as well. So many different countries put a lot of resources into international broadcasting during the Cold War. Some of the key moments, I think you would say that the Hungarian Rising in 1956 is one of the real key moments, because there are some accusations that the American broadcasters had been encouraging the Hungarian Rising and making promises of American support, which of course don't happen. So the American broadcasters, I think, feel that this was a mistake, whereas the British broadcasters don't do that, and it's seen as being they keep their audiences better because of that. People don't feel betrayed. But the other very interesting thing about the Hungarian Rising is that it happens at the same time as the Suez Crisis in 1956, when the British and the French and the Israelis invade Egypt. And so Britain finds it very hard to claim the moral high ground over Hungary, because it has been involved in what was very clearly a plot to invade Egypt. So, and at the same time, the BBC is trying to tell people about what's happening in Suez and tries to stay quite politically neutral. And it's the moment when the British government gets closest to formally taking over the BBC international broadcasts, because the British government is so unhappy about how the BBC covers Suez. So 1956 is a really, really important moment for international broadcasting.
Is it the first tensions with government from BBC side?
It's not the first tensions, no. But one of the things that's really difficult to understand and unpick is a very strange relationship between the BBC and the British government. Because in theory, all that the Foreign Office, the British government's department which deals with the BBC, all that it's allowed to do is say which languages the BBC can broadcast in, how many hours every week, and give advice. But nobody believes that is the limit of the government influence. And I've been doing some research in the archives in Britain, and it's clear that there's very, very close relationship between the BBC and the British government. They're meeting, they're talking, they're exchanging information. The Foreign Office is offering advice. It has something called the Foreign Office Information Research Department, which sounds very, innocuous, but is actually the secret anti-communist propaganda wing of the Foreign Office. Okay. So information research is actually anti-communist propaganda, and they are constantly talking to the BBC. They're often quite frustrated by the BBC because it doesn't do what it's told all the time, but they're constantly critiquing what the BBC does and making suggestions, many of which it does follow. So it's a very subtle relationship. It's not direct control, but it's very strong influence.
You said giving advice. That's very interesting.
Yes.
Advice is very neutral from one perspective.
Exactly. Yes.
Anyway.
And, when these people are meeting, it's never very clear how much the BBC has to take the advice, but it can't completely reject it. Where Suez is different is then the British Prime Minister at the time is very angry with the BBC, and he personally intervenes and threatens to take the international broadcasts under direct government control. That's a very unusual moment. Normally, it's a much more subtle relationship.
Very interesting. Actually, you can read 20th century history through radio history, through radio events, let's say back then. But as we have limited time for this conversation, I would like to get back to BBC as an instrument of British power and identity. Because, BBC is one of the things, marks of Britishness, let's say, abroad. You have plenty of associations while saying BBC in head, let's say. But anyway, how this was constructed from the beginning, this, let's say, this mission of British identity and power from 20s and onward.
I mean, Britain is clearly a declining power from the 1920s, at least with hindsight. Britain's international role is changing and constricting, and Britain has much less economic power in the 1920s than, say, America. But what the decision to create the BBC does, and the BBC has a monopoly in Britain up till the 1950s, there's no other broadcaster in Britain. The BBC is the only radio broadcaster. It puts a lot of power in one place. And so Britain has a broadcaster which can compete with any other broadcaster in the world, and in many ways is even bigger than the American radio chains, there are many of them, and they compete with each other. They don't have the same ability to project British culture nationally and overseas. So the BBC is always able to punch above its weight, I think, for Britain as a voice of British soft power. And the BBC is also quite willing to work with the government and to get subsidies in order to project British soft power overseas. So I think we really have to see it as a subcontractor for British soft power. That history goes right back to the 1930s, when the BBC founds its first service for international listeners, which is called the BBC Empire Service. So it's for listeners in the British Empire. The reality is a lot of Americans listen to it because it's in English. Then the BBC goes on just before the Second World War to start broadcasting German, French, Italian. By the end of the Second World War, the BBC is broadcasting in 45 different languages. And then in the Cold War, it continues with government support to provide programs in a very wide range of languages. So it's a very powerful voice. It would argue that it is a truthful and objective voice. I think we can ask questions about some of that, but the reputation the BBC has for truthfulness is one of its most powerful assets. And I think civil servants tend to recognise that one of the documents says, well, the BBC is not a tactical weapon. It's not for telling lies at a particular moment to win a small victory. It's a strategic weapon. It's about the big picture of long-term British interests and telling a story that serves British agendas. So you can't break the strategic weapon by telling lies for tactical goals.
But the decline of empire, the British Empire, actually affected enormously BBC itself. So it had to find a new way of surviving and operating in overseas, right?
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that the BBC also plays a significant role in projecting British influence during the decolonisation period. So in projecting British influence into Africa and Asia after independence. So one of the other things I've been researching is that there are radio stations that the BBC sets up, often on small islands near big population centres in Africa and Asia, which are there to make sure that the growing number of African and Asian listeners who can now afford to buy a cheap radio set in the 1960s when suddenly small transistor radios become very cheap, you can reach those people, not just in English, but in African and Asian languages as well. So the BBC, with the British government support, builds these big radio stations in very remote places in order to keep projecting British influence into that post-colonial world. So it still has those post-imperial connections going right through to, not too long ago, maybe even now.
BBC, from a side, we take it as a stable historical institution, but it repeatedly transformed itself from radio to television, from monopoly to competition, from purely public service broadcaster to more open, more commercial or global media organization. So the history is more adoption rather than continuity.
Yes,
BBC history.
Yes, I think that's true. And that history is continuing to the present day. The BBC faces lots of critics in Britain. It's become a bit of a political football, and there are questions about how the BBC is funded and managed, which have attracted a lot of political controversy over the last few years. And every 10 years, the BBC's charter, which is its foundational constitutional document, that has to be renewed by Parliament. And we're just coming now into the period where it has to be renewed again. And some political parties in Britain would like to see the BBC reduced to a much smaller size, or maybe thrown out entirely. The current government has said it wants the BBC to continue, but there's a big question about how it's funded. And if they change how it's funded, how that will affect its ability to produce programs, but also its political independence. So there's a big debate happening in Britain over the next year or so, which we might see another transformation. And I think what's quite interesting about what the BBC has said so far about this is that it really wants to present itself as a broadcaster for an era after broadcasting, that it wants to be at the forefront of new digital technologies and ways of consuming the media, and doesn't want to be associated with the legacy media of radio and television.
But that's really another question, the technological adaptation and how, let's say, BBC being the largest national broadcaster in terms of the internet organization looks like middle-sized business. And it's not that, well, the scale of size is not that any longer anyway. But in political sense, when do you think these tensions began? Is it pandemics, let's say, or, well, 20s?
Yes, I think the BBC was quite good at adapting to the internet initially. and to putting its programs online and having a very big website with lots of information.
Well, everybody follows BBC Sounds, let's say, or
yeah, exactly. Yes, and the BBC actually had to reduce some of its online presence because some magazines were saying, well, it's not fair that the BBC has a website with lots of food recipes on it because our Cookery Bank magazine can't sell any issues now. So people have tried to reduce what the BBC did online initially. I think once people really started subscribing to lots of different streaming services, consuming a lot more of their media as short form content. And as you say, the pandemic made a big difference because it accelerated some of the changes that were already happening. And a lot of people moved much more of their media consumption online. They consumed more media during the pandemic. They went a little bit more to the BBC, but they went a lot more to Disney Plus or Amazon or TikTok.
And new, let's say, podcaster media was born back in pandemics.
Yes. So there has been that intensification of competition for viewers and listeners and readers. And also I think the BBC has fallen behind in its ability to gather metadata about its audiences, to tailor its content. And that partly reflects the fact that the BBC has been in a real financial bad situation for quite some time because of a government that didn't want to see increased funding going to the BBC. And as inflation has increased, the value of the BBC's revenue has dropped and it's making lots of cuts. So it doesn't necessarily have the resources to make that transition to compete with the big global streaming services.
And here we need to remind that BBC is a huge organization anyway. It's about how many, 20,000?
It's very, yes, I mean, it's very hard to...
Employees.
Yeah, because it's very hard to pin it down because a lot of what the BBC does is not done anymore by the public corporation. A lot of its work is either getting independent companies to make content for the BBC, but it also has its own commercial arm called BBC Studios, and they make content and sell it to the BBC, but they also sell it to other broadcasters as well. So the BBC has become more commercial. It perhaps has a survival strategy by having a more commercial arm. It's not just reliant on the public corporation. The brand of the BBC still exists as this commercial arm as well. So it's perhaps smaller as a public corporation than it has been in the past, but much bigger as a commercial organization.
A hub of everything.
Yeah.
For the very end of our conversation, what does it mean to write BBC history? Well, I know that there were some huge attempts to write history of BBC, like 5 volumes, and you managed to compress those volumes to a monography-length book. How long did it take, and what was the process actually of getting in such organization?
It was trying to write a history of the BBC that people want to read. So less obsessed with the internal institutional politics and personalities, thinking more about the programs, thinking more about how people responded to what they listened to, thinking about the critics of the BBC as well, and trying to have, so as you say, there's a big 5-volume official history of the BBC. I've wanted to write something that's not official and takes a different view. I think also when you're writing from today's perspective, a lot of the things that maybe 20 or 50 years ago seemed natural, that the BBC was this great presence, that there was little competition, that the BBC was the crowning achievement of the British media. Today, that seems much less to be the story because the transformations that internet and social media have brought to Britain's media and the world's media, you're no longer telling the story of the triumph of the BBC, which those official histories were celebrating. In some ways, you're writing an obituary, it seems, or at least you're writing a history of a very different organisation that, as you said, has transformed itself again and again
Constantly.
Over time. It's a time when that history seems very relevant to trying to understand what's going on now and what might happen in the future, but also very hard to make predictions.
And this history keeps on going. So another 5 volumes now are assembled anyway. But very last question about your forecast about another 100 years. Well, we are celebrating 100 years of Lithuanian radio, and this is the significant date of our media history. Radio proved itself as very resilient. I mean, all those transformations, they were challenge for radio, but at the same time opportunity. And being a radio person, I still believe that radio adopted the internet age even better than the television did, because it's more flexible. It began, it's now called not radio, it's called audio media, let's say. What do you think, how do you think radio will develop in the near future?
I mean, it's a very interesting parallel. So when television was introduced and became so dominant in the 1950s, many people inside broadcasting said, this is the death of radio.
Yeah.
Radio is now a dead medium.
Here are the keys.
Yes.
We're leaving.
Exactly. And anyone who wants a future in broadcasting should move to television. And only the people left behind in radio, they will gradually disappear. That didn't prove to be the case. And radio continued to be a really important medium, and it still is. And as you say, the links between online consumption of radio, podcasting, streaming radio, it's still a very important medium for national broadcasters and local broadcasters, and the ability to reach a very small local audience and serve that audience is still really important. But as you've mentioned already, in places like Ukraine, Sudan, the power of radio to cross national borders.
VFM network.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And also shortwave and these powerful transmitters which you can broadcast from far away to reach people who still have the radios that are capable of picking up those broadcasts. In Britain, the government of Boris Johnson was never very favourable to the BBC, but it gave the BBC more money to broadcast in Russian and Ukraine after the invasion, Russian and Ukrainian, after the invasion of Ukraine. It still has very important tactical and strategic uses. So I don't think radio is going anywhere soon, and probably it will reinvent itself once again.
Again and again and again.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very Buddhistic philosophy of radio.
Reincarnation, yeah.
Good. Thank you, Simon. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.